2017 semester. I'm very excited to have you all here in our new space, the George J. Costas Research Institute of Homeland Security. So welcome. I'm going to kick it off over to Angela Marcucci, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Jeannie C. Stevens, who is the Dean's Professor of Sustainability Science and Policy in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. She is also Associate Director for Strategic Research Collaborations at the New Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern. She has brought handouts about the Institute, and these can be found outside the room. Her research, teaching, and community engagement focuses on social dimensions of renewable energy transformation, reducing fossil fuel reliance, and strengthening resilience by integrating social justice with climate energy policy. Jeannie is a 2015-16 Leopold Leadership Fellow, and she was previously on the faculty at the University of Vermont and Clark University. She earned her MS and PhD at Caltech in Environmental Science and Engineering, and her BA at Harvard in Environmental Science and Public Policy. Today, her presentation will reframe the transition to renewable energy as a larger social transformation that strengthens resilience by redistributing economic and political power, reducing societal inequities, and increasing gender diversity in the energy sector. May I present Jeannie Stevens, Professor.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. As mentioned, I'd like to talk about kind of two themes. One is resilience, and in this turbulent time that we're in, it's obviously a very important thing to be thinking about. What can make our communities and our society more resilient? And then I'm also going to be talking about energy and the renewable energy transformation in particular, because there's a lot of change happening that you may or may not know about, but a lot of potential for a lot of positive changes related to the renewable energy transition. Let's see here. So on Tuesday, I was at the Massachusetts State House testifying in support of a bill for Massachusetts, the 100% Renewable Energy Act. And so this is just some pictures of me and some other colleagues who were testifying. There was a full afternoon of testimony. The bill is still in committee, so it hasn't yet gone to the full vote or anything. But it's an exciting time, and Massachusetts is uniquely positioned to be a leader in renewable energy. So what I want to do today, with the time that I have with you, is kind of explain why I think that this 100% renewable energy bill is so important, and all this potential for the future when we think about energy system change and how that can strengthen resilience. So I'm going to go through, this is kind of an agenda for what I'm going to talk about. I first want to just kind of introduce this idea of renewable energy transformation, then talk more explicitly about strengthening resilience and the connections between energy and resilience. And I'm going to introduce Northeastern's new Global Resilience Institute. And then I'm going to introduce this idea of energy democracy, and I'm going to talk about diversifying energy, and then talk about expanding energy teaching and learning, and some conclusions there. So I thought I'd begin, Angela gave me a very good introduction, but I just wanted to give you a little bit more sense of who I am and why I have some expertise and knowledge about this subject area. I'm very interdisciplinary. I'm not easily classified as any particular discipline, and so I wanted to give you a little bit of background. I was born and lived first in Dublin, Ireland, and my family moved to Boston when I was 8. I grew up in the Boston area then and attended Harvard, where I studied environmental science and public policy for my undergraduate. Then for graduate school, I went to California, where I studied environmental science and engineering with a focus on kind of water, soil, and carbon. My original idea was that the biggest challenges in the world were water. You know, I'd read about the next world war is going to be focused on water. But since then, I've transitioned to be thinking more about energy than water, although they are interconnected too. So then I came back to the Boston area, and I did a postdoctoral research position at Harvard for 3 years, focused on energy technology innovation. And I then was a professor at Clark University in a very interdisciplinary program, and that's in Worcester, Massachusetts, focusing on climate and energy. And then I was up in Vermont for 2 years, where I was a professor focused specifically on renewable energy and the renewable energy. Vermont has very ambitious renewable energy goals, and a lot is happening there, so that was an exciting place to be. And then last year, I moved to Northeastern, and it's been a very exciting time that I've had so far at Northeastern. Northeastern is one of the most dynamic, innovative universities out there. And it's really a fun place to be a faculty member, so I'm very happy to be here as part of the faculty at Northeastern. So what I want to talk about, start off kind of thinking about the renewable energy transformation and give you a sense of what it is specifically we're thinking about here. When I mention renewable energy, there's really a global revolution or a global transition underway. And this is on a broad scale. This is thinking big picture and long term. There's a transformation happening away from a predominantly fossil fuel-based energy system to a more renewable-based energy systems. And this is so much more than a technical substitution. We tend to think of energy as very technological, that we're going to switch this technology for that technology. But there's also something much more fundamental in the shift happening here. And that has to do with a shift from a system where we have to have fierce competition for scarce resources. That's what fossil fuels are, right? They're a scarce, limited resource. And those of us who have access to a lot of fossil fuels benefit, and people who don't have access aren't able to develop and grow in the same ways. So we've been having kind of a global competition for fossil fuels for a long time. But when you shift to a renewable-based energy system and you're not reliant on fossil fuels anymore, you don't have that competition because you can have solar panels on your roof, I can have solar panels on my roof, and we don't have to compete about it, right? It's actually infinite in a sense, right? The renewable energy, the sun is always going to keep shining, the wind will be blowing, the tides and the waves will be flowing. There's always going to be geothermal energy in the Earth's core. So to move to a system that's based on abundant, plentiful, perpetual energy is like a fundamental shift. So a lot of our geopolitical struggles in the world could be diminished if we're not fighting over the scarce resource of fossil fuels. Another important point here is that we tend to focus on supply, thinking about how are we going to get enough renewable energy for all of our energy needs. But there's a lot of potential for changes in our assumptions about how much energy we actually need. Because of fossil fuels being relatively cheap in this country, we have gotten accustomed to using a lot of energy, and we could envision a future where we have just as good lifestyle but use less energy. So I just wanted to mention also that a lot of the renewable energy discussions are often connected to concerns about climate change. Climate change and reducing carbon emissions are obviously a very important component and justification for the renewable energy transformation. But one of my main points that I hope you'll kind of take home from this talk today is acknowledging that there's so many other benefits that have nothing to do with climate change and the environment of moving to a renewable energy system. And those benefits we aren't talked about as much. And so that's why I'm really interested in exploring those and understanding those and then helping other people understand them so that we can help make the shift in an interesting and productive way. So when we talk about energy, we're not just talking about electricity, we're also talking about transportation and how we heat and cool our buildings, right? Those are all parts of the renewable energy transformation. Transportation is the hardest one. Because we have, we're accustomed to moving ourselves and moving goods all around the world, and some of the most difficult ways to envision a renewable energy future are actually connected to transportation. So the other thing that's really important to acknowledge is that a transformation of this size, of this kind, that's kind of fundamental to how our society works, is going to be disruptive, right? We can't expect a big change like this without some disruptions of different kinds. And when there's disruption, you can anticipate and expect resistance from people who are currently benefiting from the current system. They want to keep it the way it is. And people like stability too, right? So we like to think we know how things work and we know what we're doing, so we'd like to maybe keep things the same. But the exciting thing is that with disruption, there also comes opportunity for some positive changes in society. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. We talk about this transition kind of as a linear kind of thing, but in society, things are so complicated that sometimes it might seem we're actually going backward, and we're not going on this transition. So even in instances where we might feel that in some short-term slice of time, I would argue that overall, in some larger time frame, we are definitely on this transition. It's almost it's inevitable because there isn't we're going to have to be moving away from fossil fuels at some point. And some parts of the world, like Germany, is a country that has a national policy to transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And different communities all around the world are committing to this transition. But on some level, it's inevitable. So those who are able to commit to it earlier are going to be kind of ahead of the curve. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about this notion of resilience and strengthening resilience. And it's an exciting time at Northeastern because we've just launched a new Global Resilience Institute that is a university-wide institute. I'll talk a little bit about that. But when I think about resilience, what I think about is reducing vulnerabilities, right? There's all kinds of threats that can come at us anytime individually, for our communities, for our country, for our families and our organizations. And to be resilient is to reduce vulnerability. So when there's a disruption, which we know there's going to be disruptions in our lives, always, that we feel strong to address or confront as best we can, right, that disruption. So strengthening resilience, for me, really focuses on reducing vulnerabilities. And so one of the ways to do that is strengthen social infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure, and learn how to prepare for disruptions, adapt to disruptions, and learn from disruptions. So when there is a disruption, we want to learn and be aware, okay, what did we do? Did it work? How could we do things better in the future? That kind of thing. And when we talk about disruptions in the framework of resilience, we're talking about all kinds of disruptions. So obviously sudden, abrupt disruptions like the earthquake in Mexico or the hurricanes we've had a whole series of. Obviously those are very discrete, specific disruptions. But we're also talking about slowly emerging disruptions, which includes growing inequality in society, or aging, right, is a disruption of a sort, and our lives get different as we go. And so we can think about resilience in terms of those kinds of changes as well, like slowly emerging as well as sudden. And then we want to think about systems, the systems that are in our world that concentrate wealth and power are actually creating vulnerabilities rather than resilience. And in what I'm seeing increasingly in my research is that unless we are intentionally considering disparities in our systems, we are actually perpetuating inequalities by not providing equal access. So even with all of the hurricane disruptions that we've seen, we see that some people aren't that heavily impacted, and other people are very devastatingly impacted, right? And so there's a big disparity there in how resilient different communities are, and the access that people have to being prepared, right, and being able to learn and adapt and respond in an effective way. So, as I mentioned, it's a very exciting time at Northeastern with the launch of this new Global Resilience Institute. The Institute is committed to informing and advancing societal resilience around the world. We're very interdisciplinary. We're working with faculty and students and researchers across all but 9 colleges on campus. We are supporting, one of the goals of the Institute is, well, I guess there's several goals. One is to partner outside the university, very important, right? To get academic work and research engaged, and that's what Northeastern is so good at, right? In terms of always being very practical in what we're doing and how our research impacts the world. So we have we're establishing and building lots of partnerships with external partners, organizations outside the university and around the world. And within the university, we're also encouraging and catalyzing new interdisciplinary, big collaborative research teams that can address some of these problems, because the challenges of resilience are very interconnected, right? You can't just say, oh, it's all about economics, or it's all about history, or it's all about chemistry. Any of the specific disciplines with it that are within a university. So we really are working hard as a university-wide institute to help people connect with other people on campus. And as you know, Northeastern is a big university, so having some of that connective tissue to help people learn about the different work that's going on and make connections is really helpful and collaborative. So just in terms of the specific, this is connecting to the very recent events that we have just been hearing about and learning about. Puerto Rico right now, because of Hurricane Maria, is almost out of power completely, the whole island. And it may be months before power is reinstalled. And there's been quite a bit of, Puerto Rico has a lot of potential for renewable energy, but it hasn't actually deployed very much yet. And so one of the things that will inevitably be happening in the next few months is thinking about Puerto Rico and how to rebuild the energy system, and potentially think about could there be a lot more solar and renewables that would be more robust, and so the island could be more self-sufficient and hopefully resilient in the future. Hurricane Irma in Florida. This is just an example I found where renewable traffic lights, solar traffic lights, were put up temporarily because the power was out and everything is disrupted, but you could bring in these solar powered traffic lights and help get things moving again. So there's a lot of potential there. And with Hurricane Harvey in Texas, we see that there's toxic pollution that is partly from, with all the flooding, refineries and the petrochemical industry that is so prevalent in that region of the country, that gets into pollution from those industries, getting into the water and impacting many vulnerable communities. And that is related to the fossil fuel legacy system that we all rely on, right? So again, as you move away from fossil fuels and have more renewables, there will be less instances of the big petrochemical industry and the negative toxic pollution associated with that. So what I'm going to introduce now is a new idea, a new topic called energy democracy. Does anyone want to take a guess what that might mean? Yeah.
The availability of energy across the entire spectrum of people in the country, all social groups and classes.
Right. So well distributed, right? And access across for everybody.
There's a difference between access and distribution, however.
Mm-hmm.
And which one are we addressing, or both?
Well, I think probably both.
Okay.
So anyone else want to have another idea about what this might mean? Yeah?
Like you said about availability to everybody, regardless of the money factor.
Right. How much it costs and yeah. I think that's a big one, because energy costs the same for everybody. So if you have a lot of money, your energy bill is just, you don't even notice it, you don't care, right? You don't pay attention. I'm just saying, like, comparatively, relatively. Whereas if you're on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, your energy bill can be a huge percentage of your income, right? And then that in and of itself is kind of not fair in a way, right? It can be seen as a kind of regressive situation there. So, so I've been exploring this idea of energy democracy for the past year or two. And we have a new paper coming out sometime soon on this. But it's really a novel concept and an emergent social movement where people are asking for kind of local control and local power in a lot of urban contexts and a lot of communities around the country. It really connects energy system change with social justice issues, as we just talked about. And it integrates concerns about the environment and climate with social justice, concerns about income inequality, concerns about racism, concerns about distribution of wealth, and even basic human rights. So it really is a movement that envisions an alternative model of shared distributive wealth and new legal and governing structures that's much more community-based rather than corporate-controlled. One of the things is that this corporate control is something that's kind of fundamental to this whole idea, and what it focuses on is the influence that a lot of corporations, including big energy companies, have had on our society. So the fossil fuel industry and some of these large mega energy companies are among the most profitable in the world, yet they're characterized by income inequality. If you look at like what the workers in the companies make versus what the CEO makes, it's almost some of the worst discrepancies there. And our public resources are supporting this, right? Because we have a lot of subsidies in our government to help us have access to energy. We support and encourage these companies. And we've learned recently that the fossil fuel industry knew about climate change and a lot of the negative impacts of burning fossil fuels since the 1980s, and they've been very strategically promoting an intentional campaign to confuse us to think, oh, climate change isn't a problem. So there's evidence and there's court cases now, and this is like a real thing that it's now been documented, that these companies have very effectively confused the American public about climate change. More so than in any other country. Other parts of the world, the confusion about whether or not climate change is real is not as much of an issue as it is here, unfortunately. So, as I mentioned, the energy democracy movement is really a response to these growing inequities in our society and the unequal distribution of the impacts of both our energy system and our climate system. Because we also have a situation where, remember when I talked about Hurricane Harvey in Texas? A lot of the communities near the oil refineries are very vulnerable and poor communities. And a lot of them are minority communities. And so there's a big discrepancy and very much unequal distribution of the risks of our fossil fuel-based system as well as the benefits. And finally, I'll just point out that politically, the fossil fuel industry has had a lot of influence in our political system in terms of campaign donations. We know that to run for president, you need to have backing, right, from many big corporations, and the alliances of donor support that are connected with the fossil fuel industry have been very powerful in both parties. So this whole idea of democratizing and decentralizing energy, giving communities more control, redistributing the control as well as the benefits is really powerful, and a lot of communities and environmental and energy activists are connecting with other activists in other areas who are more concerned about some of the social or racial disparities in our society in very exciting ways. So there's really a growing social movement, as I mentioned. It's somewhat like the local food movement, which we all kind of have probably heard about. That now there's a growing sense that it would be really valuable for communities to also have more control about their energy system and have more local and regional energy. A very interesting paper was just published a couple weeks ago that actually connected the Black Lives Matter movement with the renewable energy transformation and really acknowledging how these different social movements are connecting. And this paper explicitly looked at how many energy experts who don't usually think in terms of social issues are embracing a much more holistic view of energy systems. And the reverse is also happening. The corollary is also happening. Many of the anti-racist activists are acknowledging how energy systems and the kind of more technological issues related to energy actually are aligned with their agenda. So there's some really interesting alliances of different social movements that are happening here. And just again to summarize what energy democracy is all about, it's really about re-envisioning and redefining political power through energy power. So instead of thinking of all of us as energy consumers, thinking of us as energy citizens, instead of thinking about energy as a commodity that we have to compete for, think of it as a public good. And instead of thinking of it simply as energy infrastructure, thinking of it as public works and common resources. And then this final one on the bottom here is what I mentioned before, moving away from corporate control to more community control and public control of our future. Because it has a lot of impacts to all of us. So I wrote a book in 2015 called Smart Grid Revolution, Electric Power Struggles. And in this book, we went around the country and interviewed all kinds of people who work in energy about their vision of the future. And smart grid is just a term that's been used to categorize all the new technologies that are possible for making our energy system better in the future. And in that work, we use this analogy of the elephant. If you were blindfolded and put a whole lot of people and everyone touched the elephant in a different place, we'd all see something very different, right? Like someone would see the tusk, someone would feel the tail or the leg, and depending on where you are in this big system, you see very different things. And that's what we found in our work on energy. Depending on what part of the energy system you work in or you're familiar with, you see very different things happening in energy. So there's some tensions in the people we interviewed and talked to. We did focus groups in 7 states around the country. There were some tensions regarding how much technological change should or could happen in the future versus social change. There was also tension about how centralized or decentralized the system should be, and whether we should have radical change, like totally different future, or try to keep things the same and just have small incremental change. So building on that book that we wrote that explored, and that research that explored the renewable energy transformation broadly, I've now been looking more at this notion of energy democracy as one particular vision of the future. And the energy democracy vision is really more on the side of more radical change. So our societies might actually be quite different than they are right now in the future if we have some of the principles of energy democracy. And they could be more decentralized, meaning more distributed, right? Like what you were mentioning, in terms of having different communities would have different mix of renewable energy technologies and rely on, and it would be much more distributed rather than central, like one power plant that we all need access to. So within the policy goals of this framework, there are kind of 3 three ideas. One is resisting the current system, which is actually a big, important part of this transformation, and then reclaiming and restructuring the future energy system with a lot more community ownership and focus on what people really need, not maximizing profit for the companies. So one of the ways that we envision this is, and a lot of the people thinking about this are thinking about, is redistributing the power. As I mentioned, not just the electricity, but with it, the economic power and the political power. And there's visions of really a heterogeneous mix. We won't all necessarily just rely on solar power or wind power. Each community or region could have an locally appropriate mix. And then it'll be more relevant and appropriate for each community. I guess the one opposite perspective has been proposed, or the framing, I guess I should say, at the national level right now, is a focus on energy dominance, which is almost the opposite of energy democracy. It is, the Trump administration has declared that energy dominance is the principle by which the United States government currently would like to prioritize energy policy, which is really about accelerating extraction of fossil fuels and really not paying much attention at all to renewables, and even withdrawing some of the support that renewables have had in the past. What do you notice about this photograph?
All men.
All men. Yeah. Which is a good segue into the next part of my talk, because I actually want to talk about diversifying the energy, diversification of energy in terms of the people. I'm not going to go into much more on that. Okay, so I'd like to talk about diversifying energy. And I've worked in the energy sector for about 10 or 15 years now, and I'm often one of only a few women in the room at many of the conferences I go to. And so this is a generic photograph that I took a few years ago at an energy conference in Washington, D.C., of a panel. And as you can see, it's all men. And I know there are a lot of sectors, right, that are all men, or dominated by men, but in energy it's particularly acute. And the gender imbalance in the energy sector is widely apparent, but there aren't many people doing much about it. And I don't think what is lost by having a male-dominated sector isn't fully appreciated. So we did some research and wrote a paper about the value of having more diverse energy sector. And we know from research in more generally that diversity helps organizations, helps communities, it strengthens communities and organizations, and also encourages innovation, right? When you have different people coming from different perspectives with different ideas, different backgrounds, you can think of some new and different ideas in a better way. So there's been different kinds of studies that have been done that talk about how diversity can actually promote sustainable practices. There's been some research done in environmental sociology that points out that in industrialized countries, women are more likely than men to express concern about the environment, support environmental protection, and enact pro-environmental behaviors. So if you accept that, then you realize, like, if there's more women in the energy sector, people might be more concerned for the environment in energy decisions. Also, with diversification, and this is beyond just women, but also different racial and cultural groups being involved in energy, there's different ways to empower communities and encourage more engagement, because different people, whatever you do for your job, you bring it home to your household and to your community. So if there are more different kinds of people working in energy, that'll be brought back to households and communities in different ways. This is an interesting one in terms of diversity can actually also accelerate innovation. You may have heard of this. This was some research that was done that identified, how air-conditioned buildings are often too cold?
Yeah.
apparently the algorithm for setting the temperature in air-conditioned office buildings was set back in the 50s, and it was based on when office buildings were mostly all men, and they were all wearing full suits, right? So the temperature is way too cold, oftentimes, and most people aren't wearing necessarily in the summer full suit now, and things have gotten more casual, and there are a lot more women in the offices, right? And women on average, their metabolism is different and are more comfortable at a higher temperature because the resting heart rate is different. So that's an interesting thing too, that if there were more women paying attention to building energy in buildings, right, this probably would have been figured out earlier. And this is like lose, lose, lose. Like there's no benefit of this, right? People in the office are uncomfortable, it costs money, it's really like throwing money out the window, and it's actually not productive at all because people aren't as productive when they're not comfortable and when they're at work. So that's another example of how diversity can actually help with being more efficient and with innovative thinking. This is a little bit of an interesting one. This is work that was done on all kinds of risk perceptions, and I apologize for this figure because I recognize on the left here are tiny, tiny words that I know you cannot read, but I'll read. They're basically all kinds of risks on the left axis. Cigarette smoking, AIDS, car accidents, drinking alcohol, climate change, coal burning power plants, nuclear power. These are all lists of things that we might be worried about. And what this study did was ask a whole bunch of people what they thought the risks were. And what they found is that this line on the left is what all the white men thought about the average of all the white men who were in the group who were asked. And on the right is both the non-white men, the non-white women, and the white women. Sorry. So everyone else sees things as this is more risky, this is less risky. So the point here is that, then this is on average, and this is not. The point here is that the white men in general, on average, see everything as less risky. And so what that tells us also about, if you think about the energy sector, we can think about everything is seen in the energy sector, if it's dominated by men, as less risky. So this is an interesting finding here too. So before moving on, I just wanted to give one example of an organization called Grid Alternatives that is really working it's a solar installation organization, and they're also working on workforce training, so training people for renewable energy jobs. And their mission is really to make the renewable energy technology and jobs available to underserved communities. So what I'm highlighting here is actually also the job creation potential, because with a distributed renewable energy future, if each community has some solar power, some wind, there's going to be lots of local jobs just in terms of maintaining and installing and paying attention to monitoring and measuring all of those local energy systems. So there, as well as manufacturing opportunities in terms of creating the solar panels and all of that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about broadening the whole discussion about energy and how we're doing that at the university. I'm part of a national group called the Council of Energy Research and Education Leaders, where we're trying to get energy discussions and learning into the university at different levels. As I mentioned, studying energy, just like studying resilience, doesn't fit neatly into one kind of major or another, right? Like conventionally you could say if you want to go into the energy sector, you should do some kind of engineering, right? And become some kind of an energy engineer. But there's also a lot of economics and social issues and policy that needs to go that's focused on energy. So one of the things a lot of universities are focusing on are there programs or degrees that are kind of like energy studies, right? That integrate all of these different things that you need to know if you want to learn and work and have a career in energy. And at Northeastern, we have a master's of energy systems that is a very successful, popular program. And that's my class. A lot of students who are in that master's program come to my class, and they're very excited because it is also a lot of engineering and finance. And then what the course I teach offers them is more of the kind of the social context and the political context within which all of these energy system changes are happening. And so there's also been a broader acknowledgement around the world about energy, an under-evaluation of social science in energy. So there's a new journal called Energy Research and Social Science. So it's kind of opening up to think about social issues associated with energy. And so that's also happening. In thinking about the role of the university in society, that's something I'm also very interested in as someone who works at a university, but who's also very socially engaged. And I knew I always wanted to, have growing up when I was little, I never thought I would be a university professor. I thought I would be in DC, maybe working as an environmental advocate or something. But there's so much potential for impact that universities have. So I kind of characterize the role of the university in society in these 4 ways. Universities teach, obviously, and that's the primary role in that we can orient the kinds of explorations and transdisciplinary courses that are teaching these skills to be prepared for a complicated future. We can do research in the space of energy and how energy connects with society. We can also think about the campus itself as a model for society, and that involves having renewable energy right on our own campus, or committing to buying renewable energy rather than fossil-based energy. And we also can engage with partners and communities and organizations outside the university and be involved in societal discussions and trying to help solve problems that are related to the renewable energy transition outside of the university. So at Northeastern, we are trying to advancing all 4 of these in different ways. And it's been an exciting place to be teaching and doing research and engaging on these issues. I did also want to mention Northeastern has a new Toronto campus. And this summer I was up there for a week and I taught a week-long summer institute. And we partnered with the Advanced Energy Center, which is an energy innovation organization in Toronto. And it was really a fun experience, and we had a mix between graduate students and energy professionals, so people who are working in the energy sector who want to come back and learn more about the renewable energy transformation and how they can be involved in a different way in their jobs. So that was a good experience. And you may hear more about Northeastern's new campuses, because the university has ambitions for becoming more global and having a reach beyond the Boston area. So in conclusion, and then we can open up for questions, I would just say we're in a very dynamic time. I like to show this figure here. If you tried to play soccer on that soccer field with conventional rules, it wouldn't work, right? The ball would fall right down to the water. So the point of that figure is that conventional rules and assumptions and conventional disciplines, right, how we think about issues, need to be adjusted as the landscape changes. And that's what we're doing with the work that we're doing at Northeastern. And it's a dynamic time, so it requires responsiveness and flexibility. And in thinking about societal resilience and how to strengthen societal resilience, we need to pay more attention to interdependencies in how all of our different systems are connected, and we have to be anticipating inevitable change, because things are not going to stay the same. We know that. So also in conclusion, I just wanted to reemphasize that the renewable energy transformation that is occurring globally really has huge potential for social change as well as social justice and political change. Renewable-based energy provides resilience in the increasingly turbulent world that we're in. So moving away from a fossil fuel reliance is only going to strengthen us ultimately as we deal with all kinds of disruptions. There are multiple mechanisms for implementing diversification of the energy sector and also energy democracy, and thinking about broadening the discussions and how we even think about energy as like a socially important and culturally important piece of our communities and our world, but also distributing the benefits and decision making. Who has power, who gets to decide, and letting more individuals and communities have control over the energy system that they want. And a final point here is I just want to highlight that we saw this photograph with all men making, involved in very important decisions that impact all of us. And so if we are not intentional, or if intentional exclusion of diverse voices is not challenged, the situation could get worse in terms of who's making decisions for us on our behalf. And ultimately, the United States, we pride ourselves on having representation of all people making decisions. And it's not happening. And so silence and inaction at multiple levels can actually perpetuate inequalities and perpetuate disparities among us, so that some people are, doing very well, and more people are not doing well and have less prospect and hope for doing well in the future, which is a very, not a strong position to be in, right? We would like to be in a world or a country or a community or a state where we feel like everyone has access to stability and critical needs. Their needs are being met, and exciting opportunities. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your time, and I'd be happy to have a discussion and have some questions. And I'd like to acknowledge my team of students that work with me right now at Northeastern. I call it a climate energy research team, and this includes some undergraduates, some master's students, and some PhD students who are all working with me on some of these very relevant issues. And thank you very much.
Thank you.